Isn't that something to think about, beloved? That is really something to think about. And it should then behoove us all to behave accordingly, which is described in verse 17. Wherefore, come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you. Now, beloved, don't mistake this for salvation. Remember what he's talking about. He's talking about sanctification with a view towards service. And when he says such things, what is in view? Ultimately, what is in view here? We've already been received. Ephesians chapter 1 tells us that. Up front, upon the moment of salvation, beloved, we have already been received. What's he talking about then when he says, I will receive you? He's talking about the Bema seat. That's what's in view there. The rewards that we will receive at the Bema seat. That's what's in view there. And of course, he's quoting from the Old Testament, so he would say something like that, I will receive you. But at the Bema seat, when we are received, it's for what purpose? Rewards. You see? That's what he's talking about. And then he goes on and he says, and I will be a father unto you, and ye shall be my sons and daughters, saith the Lord Almighty. Remember, this term is used to describe God not in his great creative strength, but in his great strength as being the giver, the God of all grace. That's what he's talking about here. And the idea is to come out and walk separate unto the Lord, and he will receive us and reward us and supply us accordingly. Now, beloved, let me ask you this question. Those under the Old Testament now, and the Old Testament I'm speaking of, under that Old Testament program, what would happen to someone that would bring something into the temple that would defile it? What would happen to them? Well, either God would strike them dead right then and there, or they were taken out and stoned. Right? Okay. Now that was under the Old Testament program. Now we know that that's not going to happen today. Hopefully somebody's not going to take us out and stone us. Let's hope not. But let's look at what God has to say. Now, is this not interesting? Again, where are we going to go to? We're going to go to 1 Corinthians. Now, look at what Paul says to the Corinthians in his first letter concerning this same subject of the temple and separation. Notice what he says here in chapter 3. Again, what's he talking about in chapter 3 of 1 Corinthians? He's talking about the Bema seat, the judgment seat of Christ. That's what's in view. He's talking about wood, hay, stubble. He's talking about gold, silver, precious stones. He's talking about what's going to happen there. And notice what he says in chapter 3, 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16. Now notice here, keep this in mind. What's the subject matter? Sanctification with a view towards service with the ultimate rewards at the judgment seat of Christ. Verse 16. Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? If any man, now notice this, if it was important under the Old Testament, so important that the person would be stoned, look at this. How much more important it would be for us. If any man defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy, for the temple of God is holy, which temple ye are. Now again, don't get this wrong. He's not talking about losing one's salvation. And he's not talking about in the sense that God will strike you dead like he did in the Old Testament. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about go back to what he's talking about up here in these former verses where he begins to talk about the judgment seat of Christ. in verse 8 and going down to verse 13 or verse 14. He's talking about a man's works abiding. If a man's works abide, if a man's work is burned out at the judgment seat of Christ, that's what he's talking about. So then, God makes it very clear under the Old Testament what defiled the temple back then. What would defile the temple today, beloved? Now, here again is where a lot of misunderstanding is concerned. Now, it's true. We should live, we should conduct ourselves on an outward basis, and we shouldn't be going around cussing and ripping and gambling and smoking and drinking and carrying on and this and that and the other. We shouldn't be going around acting like that. What are we? What are we called to be? Ambassadors. Would that be a fitting behavior for ambassadors of Christ? No. If we acted like that? No, of course not. So, of course, it goes without saying. That goes without saying that that's not how we should be conducting ourselves as ambassadors for Christ. So then, what is he zeroing in on when he talks about that which is going to defile the temple? Now, we're the temple. We're the temple. Remember that. He's not talking about some building. He's talking about you and me. What's going to defile us, beloved? Yes, that kind of behavior would defile us. Yes, that's true. But you know what? That's temporary, isn't it? You know, if we went around smoking and drinking and cussing and running around with all kinds of unsavory people, that's, physically speaking, that's all going to catch up to us, isn't it?
Sure it is.
It's going to catch up to us. All right? But that's all temporary, right? This flesh that we're housed in, that's temporary. It's the eternal, that which we cannot see. Look at this. Look at this. Look, go down chapter 4. No, excuse me. 2 Corinthians chapter 4. If you flip over to 2 Corinthians real quick. Chapter 4, 2 Corinthians, verse 18. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 18. While we look not at the things which are seen. That's drinking and smoking and gambling and running around and carousing and doing all that other stuff. That's things that we can see. But at the things which are not seen. That could be the things that we believe, the things that we teach, the things that we meditate on. Okay? Among other things. That's just some of the things, okay? For the things which are seen are what? Temporal. They're temporary. All those things are going to pass. Along with the flesh, it's going to pass. But the things which are not seen are what? Eternal. So don't you think for a moment that the apostle, when he says that God will destroy the temple, will destroy him, shall God destroy, don't you think that he's talking about something more than that which can be seen, the temporary, but rather that which can't be seen, the eternal? Has to do with what we take in and believe as members of the body of Christ. The doctrine, the teaching, the sound doctrine, the teaching. And Paul gives us many ample warnings concerning that. But the thing is, beloved, this is what Paul's talking about when he's talking about defilement of the temple. Now then, but the thing is, the same principle applies in that if you're going to mess around with the temple of God, God's going to do something to you, right? That's the idea, right? Well, look at this. Now look at this. Okay? Now we can go over to 2 Timothy. Go to 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy chapter 2. Now, beloved, this is all so important because, you see, for many of us, myself included, for many of us, we carry baggage. We carry baggage over from our either denominational days or